The kitchen was alive with the rhythmic clatter of knives on a cutting board and the simmering hiss of sauce in a pan. Julia wiped her hands on her apron, glancing at the clock above the sink. It was late afternoon, and the golden light of autumn poured through the windows, bathing the room in warmth. Yet, the coziness did little to ease the restlessness simmering inside her. She had always found solace in cooking, a ritual of control when life felt chaotic. Today was no different. The tension between her and her husband, Mark, had grown unspoken but palpable over the past few months. He worked long hours and spoke little when he was home. The silence between them had become a gaping chasm, and Julia found herself filling the void with the hum of the stove and the weight of her thoughts. As she stirred the sauce, the sound of the front door creaking open startled her. Julia wasn't expecting anyone, and Mark had made it clear he wouldn't be home until late. She froze, her hand gripping the wooden spoon. "Julia," a familiar voice called out. Relief swept over her, though it was quickly followed by a flutter of nerves. Alex, her stepson, stood in the doorway, his figure backlit by the hallway light. He had returned earlier than expected from his work trip, his bag slung over one shoulder and a warm smile playing on his lips. "Alex," Julia said, setting the spoon down. "You surprised me. I didn't think you'd be back until tomorrow." "I finished early," he replied, stepping into the kitchen. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Of course not," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's nice to have company for a change." Alex set his bag down and leaned against the counter, his presence filling the room in a way that was both comforting and disarming. He was a younger version of his father, with the same sharp jawline and confident demeanor, but his eyes held a softness that Mark's lacked. "You've been busy," Alex observed, nodding toward the array of dishes spread across the counter. Julia laughed lightly, a sound that felt foreign even to her. "Cooking helps me think." He tilted his head, studying her. "Anything in particular on your mind?" The question was casual, yet it struck a chord. Julia hesitated, not wanting to burden him with her troubles. "Nothing important," she said finally. "Just the usual." Alex didn't press, instead moving closer to inspect the pot on the stove. "Smells amazing. Can I help with anything?" His offer caught her off guard. Mark rarely stepped foot in the kitchen unless it was to grab a plate, and the gesture felt unexpectedly kind. "You can set the table if you want," she said, pointing to the cupboard. As Alex moved to retrieve the plates, Julia couldn't help but notice his ease, the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence. There was a warmth to him, a genuine interest in the world around him that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. "So," Alex said as he placed the plates on the table, "how have things been here? With Dad, I mean." Julia paused, her grip tightening on the spoon. "Busy," she said carefully. "You know how he is with work." Alex nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "Yeah, he's always been that way. I guess I hoped things might be different now." His words hung in the air, unspoken truths threading between them. Julia felt a pang of guilt, both for the situation and for the comfort she found in Alex's company. She turned back to the stove, focusing on the sauce as if it could anchor her. "Your dad means well," she said, her voice softer. "He just gets caught up in things." "Doesn't mean it's okay," Alex replied, his tone measured but firm. Julia glanced at him, surprised by the weight of his words. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Breaking the silence, Alex offered a small smile. "Dinner's ready, right? Let's eat before this storm outside gets any worse." Julia looked out the window, noticing the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The wind had picked up, rattling the branches of the trees. She nodded, grateful for the distraction. As they sat down at the table, the storm began to roll in, the first drops of rain tapping against the windows. The tension that had filled the room earlier seemed to dissipate, replaced by the clink of utensils and the hum of conversation. But beneath the surface, Julia could feel the undercurrent of something she couldn't quite name, something that both intrigued and unsettled her. For now, she focused on the moment, unaware of the storm brewing not just outside, but within. The rain came down in sheets that night, drumming against the windows as Julia moved through the house, tidying up after dinner. The steady rhythm of the storm mirrored the unsettled feeling within her. She replayed the evening in her mind, the casual laughter, the shared stories, and the unexpected ease of conversation with Alex. She had always liked Alex, of course. How could she not? He was polite, thoughtful, and had a way of making everyone around him feel at ease. But tonight felt different, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. In the living room, Alex sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a relaxed posture. His presence filled the space, making the house feel less empty than it had in weeks. Julia hovered near the doorway, uncertain whether to join him or retreat upstairs. "Done for the night?" Alex asked, looking up from his phone. Julia smiled faintly. "Almost. Just making sure everything's in its place." "You're always doing something," he said, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "You should sit down for a change. Relax." It was such a simple suggestion, yet it struck her deeply. When was the last time someone had noticed her restlessness? Encouraged her to pause. After a moment's hesitation, she crossed the room and sat in the armchair opposite him. "I'm not very good at relaxing," she admitted, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I've noticed," Alex said with a teasing grin. Julia laughed softly, but her mind drifted elsewhere. She wasn't sure when it had started, this sense of being unseen. Her marriage to Mark had been a safe choice, one built on mutual respect and practicality rather than passion. She had accepted it for what it was, but lately, the loneliness felt heavier than ever. "Penny for your thoughts." Alex's voice pulled her back to the present. "Just thinking about how quiet the house feels sometimes," she said carefully, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, I get that," Alex replied. "It's strange being back here. It doesn't feel the same as when I was a kid." Julia tilted her head, curious. "How so?" Alex hesitated, as though deciding whether to share. "I guess it just feels colder. Like it's just a house now, not a home." His words hit closer to home than he could have known. Julia looked at him, searching his face for signs of resentment, but all she saw was honesty. "I've tried to make it feel warm," she said quietly. "But it's hard when," she trailed off, unsure how much to reveal. "When Dad's not really here." Alex finished for her, his tone gentle but firm. Julia's breath caught. "I didn't mean." "It's okay," Alex interrupted. "You don't have to explain. I've seen it for years. He's always been focused on work, even when Mom was alive." Julia's chest tightened at the mention of Alex's mother. She had always been careful not to step into that sacred space, respecting the memory of the woman who had come before her. But hearing Alex speak so candidly now felt like an invitation into a part of his life she hadn't dared to touch. "Your mom was amazing," Julia said softly. "I could never." "Don't," Alex said, his voice unexpectedly sharp. "Don't compare yourself to her. You've been good for him. For us." Julia blinked, caught off guard by the intensity of his words. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the room was silent except for the rain. Julia could feel the weight of Alex's gaze, but she didn't look up. Instead, she focused on the sound of the storm, letting it fill the space between them. "I don't want to make things awkward," Alex said finally. "But I hate seeing you like this. You deserve more." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken until now. Julia's throat tightened, and she struggled to find a response. How had they gotten here, to this moment where the lines between them blurred in ways she hadn't anticipated? "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything," Alex said. "Just know that you're not alone." "Not really." Julia finally looked at him, her eyes searching his for some sense of clarity. What she found instead was warmth and sincerity, emotions she hadn't felt directed at her in a long time. "I think I need to call it a night," she said, standing abruptly. "It's been a long day." Alex nodded, his expression unreadable. Course. Sleep well. As Julia climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she felt the weight of the conversation settle over her. Alex's words echoed in her mind, pulling at threads she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. She closed her bedroom door behind her, leaning against it as she tried to steady her racing heart. Somewhere beneath the surface of her thoughts, she knew this was the beginning of something she wasn't ready to face. The storm raged on outside, but inside, a different kind of storm was just beginning to take shape. The morning broke with an overcast sky, soft light spilling into the kitchen where Julia stood, absently stirring her coffee. Sleep had evaded her most of the night, her mind looping over fragments of her conversation with Alex. His words had been earnest, perhaps too much so, and they lingered like an uninvited guest she couldn't send away. She sighed, pressing the mug to her lips, hoping the warmth might anchor her. The storm had passed, but the unsettled feeling in her chest remained. The sound of footsteps drew her attention. Alex entered the room, his hair slightly tousled and a soft grin on his face. He looked younger in the morning light, his usual confidence tempered by the easy vulnerability of someone just waking up. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying a note of cautious cheer. "Morning," Julia replied, her tone neutral. She busied herself by rearranging a stack of plates on the counter, unsure how to act around him after last night. "Sleep okay?" he asked as he poured himself a glass of water. She hesitated, then offered a small shrug. "Not really. You?" "Same," he admitted. "Too much on my mind." Julia's hands stilled. She felt the weight of his words, but she didn't dare meet his gaze. Instead, she took a sip of coffee, hoping the silence would dissolve the tension. "You seemed upset last night," Alex said after a pause. "I wasn't upset," she said quickly, her voice sharper than intended. "Just tired." Alex nodded, though the concern in his eyes didn't waver. "If I said something wrong?" "You didn't," Julia interrupted, setting her mug down with a soft clink. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her expression softening. "It's just been a lot lately. That's all." For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound between them. Julia wanted to say something more, to dispel the unspoken tension, but she didn't know how. "Do you want to get out of the house today?" Alex asked suddenly. She blinked, startled by the suggestion. "Out of the house?" "Yeah," he said, his tone casual but hopeful. "Might do you some good. Clear your head." Julia hesitated, the idea both appealing and unnerving. She couldn't remember the last time she'd done something for herself, something that didn't involve cooking, cleaning, or managing the household. But the thought of spending the day with Alex felt risky, like walking a tightrope with no safety net. "I don't know," she said, her voice faltering. "I have a lot to do here." "Julia," Alex said, his tone firmer now. "You deserve a break. One day won't hurt." His words echoed what he'd said the night before, and for a moment she felt the pull of his sincerity. She glanced at him, searching his face for any hint of ulterior motives, but all she saw was earnestness. "Okay," she said finally, the words slipping out before she could second-guess it. Alex's grin widened, and for a fleeting moment, Julia felt her defenses soften. "Great," he said. "There's a little cafe I used to love when I was younger. We can grab some coffee and just get away for a bit." The drive to the cafe was filled with light conversation, the kind that danced along the surface without dipping into deeper waters. Julia found herself relaxing despite her earlier reservations, her laughter coming more easily than it had in weeks. The cafe was small and tucked away, its charm evident in the mismatched furniture and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Alex ordered for both of them, his familiarity with the place evident as he chatted briefly with the barista. They chose a corner table by the window, where the view of the street offered a quiet backdrop to their conversation. For the first time in a long while, Julia felt the weight of her worries lift, replaced by a sense of normalcy she hadn't realized she missed. As they sipped their coffee, Alex leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "You know," he began, I think this is the most relaxed I've seen you since I got here. Julia smiled faintly, stirring her coffee. Maybe I just needed to get out of the house. Or maybe, Alex said, his tone teasing, you needed someone to remind you that you're allowed to take care of yourself too. His words, though spoken lightly, carried a weight that Julia couldn't ignore. She looked at him, her smile fading as she felt the full force of his sincerity. Thank you, she said quietly. For today. Any time, Alex replied. His expression soft. The moment stretched between them, delicate and unspoken. Julia could feel the edges of something dangerous brushing against her thoughts, but she pushed it away, choosing instead to focus on the comfort of the present. As they left the cafe and stepped into the cool afternoon air, Julia felt the weight of her choices settling back onto her shoulders. She didn't know where the lines lay anymore, or if they even mattered. What she did know was that the path ahead was no longer clear, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to find her way back.